Hello, world, and welcome to another episode of History is Awesome with Dave. And I'm going to be covering, or I should say, finishing the series I've been working along. Hallelujah, gotten through it. It's been pretty long. The Reformation, and part two I'd left off at was monsters in Münster. And I want to now complete and finish this story, the story of Münster and how it has been affected by the Reformation. Before I do start this story, I'm gonna give one point of warning that at the very end of this, it culminates in some pretty serious violence and torture. And I want to give the nitty-gritty details, not because I'm a sadist, but that I just think it's fascinating the sort of behaviors that were displayed back then. But that if that is something that offends you, that you should be mindful of that because it's going to be pretty gruesome as I give the final descriptions of how this all goes down. So with that out of the way, let's get going. Okay. So to start, where had we left off? We had left off with that crazy character, Jan Matthias. And I should say as well, if you're jumping in on video 3 now and you haven't seen 1 and 2, that's cool, but you'll have a far greater context if you start with the first 2, obviously, that are available on my channel. If you don't care and you just want to hear a little bit of this story of this crazy town called Münster, please continue along with me now. So like I'm saying, we got this guy, Matthias, from the previous video, who was leading the Anabaptists in Münster, and things were getting pretty rough. They'd been under siege from the Prince Bishop for a while now, and they didn't know really what new direction they should go because they hadn't been able to break the siege. Well, their leader up until that point, the guy who'd come out as a figurehead, said that he had a revelation from God because he was this guy who kind of had a walkie-talkie, literally. He could just talk with God and know what to do. He was told that he should go out and he would be able to deflect the siege with only 15 other members. And he went out and surprise, he met with a really nasty end. He and his 15 other troops that he went out of the gates of the city with got mowed down by 500 cavalry sent by the Prince Bishop to deal with them. So it ended in a horrible, horrible way. And as you can imagine, this left the residents in the town really, really spooked because up until this point, that was their prophet. This guy was the word of God, and it left them wondering not only for their physical health, what's going to happen now the Prince Bishop knows we're leaderless, but they worry for their immortal souls, and they wonder what's going to happen. So we have a couple other people who were still a part of the leadership of Matthias's clique, if you want to call it that, still remaining in the city that I discussed before. We'll just give a little reminder here. We have Jan van Leiden, Bernard Rothman, and Bernard Nipperdolem. Now, Van Leiden is this guy. He's a failed everything, but he just keeps trying, so I respect that much. He is basically movie star handsome, and he has just been a huge figurehead in terms of his fanaticism. He's been agreeing so much with Matthias, the previous leader, that he just got connected with him. And then you have members in the city who used to belong to an old town council there, which was Bernard Nipperdolem and Bernard Rothman. Those are the other major players that history recalls well, at least from the sources I have. So they call a meeting. They call a meeting of everybody in the town, and they invite them to come to this house at night. And it's kind of surreal. They come up to this window in the town, and the window is lit by candlelight. And there is Jan van Leiden, the rock star. He's standing there with Nipperdolem, and he says that he's been given a revelation. All these guys are receiving all these revelations. And he says that what actually happened with Matthias was foreseen. And he had a dream 8 days prior to him going out on this epic ride to get sliced down and cut up that said that he was doing it for the wrong reasons. He was doing it for his own glory as opposed to God's glory. And so that is in fact why he failed. And it wasn't actually that God had turned against them. It was just that this guy had done the act in the wrong spirit. So that's what that was about. He also he's dressed all in white, putting on a big scene. And the wife of Matthias, the guy who's just recently been chopped up out in the field, she's there as well. And she's dressed all in white. Quite a striking woman from my descriptions from before. And he explains to the crowd as well that he's received an additional message saying that he should marry Matthias's wife. And so there you go. He's forming himself into a new figurehead, basically. He's picking up the walkie-talkie that Matthias used to have and carrying the torch. And so this is what people are. Yeah, I think you just need to put yourself in the context for the people there. It may seem crazy to then jump on board with this guy, but when you're already in the mindset where you can accept that someone can be a prophet and have a direct line to God, it isn't that much of a greater leap of faith to say that another person might be able to do so from the same leadership. It is, however, pretty strange considered the at least historical precedents we have when you think of somebody like, I don't know, Adolf Hitler and leading that kind of movement and holding people, enthralled, spellbound. It's usually reliant on that leader, and when you destroy that leader, you kind of break the spell that's held over the people. But in this case, they're still willing to believe in what it is that he has to say. And so they disperse for the night, knowing that he had at least put their fears to rest, that it wasn't that God was against them at this point. It was just a misinterpretation of a message from God. And a week goes by. A week passes. And then, this guy doesn't do anything subtly. Van Leiden, that is, Jan van Leiden. A week later, he runs through the streets of Münster buck naked and is struck dumb, so he can't speak, but he gets out some writing utensils and starts to write things on them and showing them to the people around them. And it amounts to him saying that I've had a revelation, so many revelations, and I'm going to reveal them to you in 3 days' time, this new revelation that he has. And that time passes, and he reveals to the town that one of the major failings that they had was that their council that had formed around Matthias wasn't strict enough, and he needed to form a new leadership group if they were going to have success in the town. And so that's what he goes about doing. He sets up his new government, and it's not surprising this is now solidifying his leadership. He's choosing people that very specifically within the previous leadership supported him most of all. So he's getting a little more power backing at this time. And he's getting pretty scary about it as well. We'd seen some violence with Matthias leading through fear tactics previously, but the violence and the weird factors are going to go through the roof. The floor is going to drop out from beneath you as Van Leiden moves into leadership, and he gives all the members, I believe there's 12 of them, it's kind of going to an old school Jewish form of leadership with old council members. He gives them all, this isn't necessarily Jewish, but he gives all his leaders swords as to represent their power over life and death. And he starts to bring back some really nitpicky details from Old Testament that might be a cause for your death. And so if you're lying, that's death. Slander, that's death. Gossip, death. Disobey your parents, death. So basically, if you do anything, you're going to get, you're up for death potentially. And the point of this system, the way it's discussed in sources, is basically that someone is going to screw up, or people will screw up, given this new slant to the leadership that exists. But he has the power, Van Leiden has the power to commute any sentence. So you are forever going to be grateful for the fact that you screw up, but Van Leiden is going to forgive you for what you've done. So you always have to be grateful to him. So he's got the power over life and death. This is absolutely totalitarian leadership that has now entered the city of Münster. It's pretty terrifying stuff. Now, that's in regards to the leadership. What happens after Matthias gets killed out in the field? Well, Leiden picks up the torch and establishes a new leadership within the town, a council built around him, basically. But outside what's going on, if you recall from the previous videos, we have the Prince Bishop who's been given the task by the crown to get Munster back. It's a very important city. And so they're going about their different preparations for eventually storming the city. They've laid siege to it and they want to get it back. And in May 22nd, 1534, they start to get ready for their first big assault on the city. And they've, because of the importance for trade, because of the importance of size of the city, many minor lords and major lords in the area have lent different things to the Prince Bishop for this war effort, specifically two massive cannons at the time, one of them named the Devil and the other his mother. So the devil and his mother. That, if anything, these people have a sense of humor. So they've got these guns lining up. Everybody's getting ready to fight, and they have a date set for the actual attack, and it's going to be dawn of May 26th. It's going to be bright and early in the morning, the break of day. And I want to do a little preamble here, just about the sort of people that you're dealing with within the Prince Bishop's army. So people at this time, a lot of them mercenaries, are enlisted, and when they fight for things, they fight for the spoils of war. And the spoils of war, well, they're pretty brutal. You know, again, it's always our modern mindset is like, oh, this is horrible. This isn't how a military would fight. But to some extent, it still does today, but it's just not quite so blatant. So these people, if you think about them, I thought this was in the sources I was looking at, it's a great way to compare them to door crasher shoppers, where if you're going to have, basically think of breaking into the city the next day, on the dawn of the 26th, is that's Black Friday or whatever the major sales days are in your country. And you want to show up early and you want to be there first because you want to get the best deals and you don't want everything to be picked over. You want to get there first for, 2-for-1 rapings. This is dark. I don't mean to be insensitive to it, but you gotta, what can you do if you can't laugh? So yeah, they want to be there for the 2-for-1 rape deal, and they don't want everybody getting ahead of them. They want to be getting there to steal whatever items it is that they can. They want to be the first to crash the gates, to get whatever spoils of war that they're going to get from having been enlisted in the Prince Bishop's army. Now, another characteristic that is shared by the members of this army is that, unlike the Anabaptists, the current residents of Münster, they like to drink. And Munsterites, Anabaptists in Münster, do not drink. And so the story goes, well, at least not the story, but from what the sources tell us, is that there's a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different troops that you have together from different places, who are in the Prince Bishop's army, who are waiting outside, getting ready to attack. And it comes to the 25th. And on the 25th, in the evening, a bunch of these troops are drinking heavily, and this is commonplace. And one particular group of Belgians are drinking really, really heavily. And they mistake the dusk for the dawn. They think that they get so liquored, they are so drunk that they think as the sun is going down, that it's the sun coming up the following day. And as one of these Black Friday, Boxing Day gate crashers, they're terrified that they're going to miss the battle. And so these guys all armor up in a panic and they start to storm the gates of Münster. And just like any good rushing line, all the other troops who have maybe been drinking a little less, but still drinking at the time, because it's the night before, they weren't getting ready for anything, they all start to respond and react to the Belgians charging the gates, thinking, well, maybe it is that they get confused just as well. And they start chasing after them until you have a flood of the Prince Bishop's soldiers, all of them, attacking the gates at the wrong time, completely drunk, afraid that they're going to miss the spoils of war. This is, look what drinking does. You know, maybe if they'd been stoned, that would have been a little better in this case. So they go and they storm the gates at this horrible time. And just for the point that I've just made, the Anabaptists are, if anything, not drunks, and they're ready for them. And it's dark and it's chaotic in there. They are not able to overcome the walls, and it's a massive loss for them. There's hundreds of Prince Bishop soldiers that die, and I believe what was the deaths for Munster? It was something under a dozen. Only 10 individuals die from the Anabaptist cause at this time. It's an absolute disaster based on drinking and being really ill prepared. And so this is probably the most surprised person when he comes out of the tent this night is going to be the Prince Bishop when he says, "You idiots, it's tomorrow morning. It's not this evening when you're all drunk." And so they attack, they fail. The attack is defended rather well in the form of the Anabaptists. And this is just fueling the flames for a group of religious extremists who think that their mission is God-given. That when you lose a major fight like this, it's really, really embarrassing, and you just encourage them to continue along, and it bolsters up now the new leadership that is Van Leiden. And to his credit, it sounds like he was fighting like a demon on a white horse, and really holding up his image at this point. So that is a failed attack. They withdraw, licking their wounds, trying to sort out why and when and where it all went wrong for them. And now we can jump back into Münster, because there's now kind of a lull in the action, because they need to reorganize when they're going to attack. And the point that I'm going to try and make, the point made from the sources at this point, is that they were not entirely passive. It wasn't just as though the Anabaptists within Münster were being attacked and they were doing nothing about it. They were trying to do raids. They had people going on assassination missions, through tunnels out of the city, maybe sneak up on some of these drunk guys, kill a few, cut a few throats in the night, ruin a few cannons, steal a few resources, this kind of thing. In one particularly sad story, there is a 15-year-old girl who has a plan, and it's from the Old Testament. It's from the story of this woman named Judith, who I don't know the story from the Old Testament, but I can understand it from how they explain it. The idea was that a woman would pretend to have defected from her cause and would go and, as I say, she would pretend to have defected. She would go over to the other leadership, and she would then seduce the leader. This is some attractive female, would sleep with him for the night and then kill him. And this is how the story goes down in the Old Testament. And there's this 15-year-old girl who offers to play this false defection and to go over and do this. And something I found really interesting, this is a cool little snippet for anybody who's read similar books. An additional aspect of her plan is that she has created a poisonous shirt, a shirt that has been somehow drenched in whatever poison that were you to wear it, you would die immediately. If you know your Arthurian legend, if you know your stories from King Arthur's evil sister, or half-sister, I can't remember exactly, Mordred, attempts to do this in one of the stories from Arthurian legend and brings, or as a gift is brought to King Arthur, that were he to have put it on, it would have killed him. Evil, just evil. Just a weird parallel. I thought that was kind of interesting, and it wasn't mentioned in the sources I was looking at. I just knew that from my own reading, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, this, as it goes, this ends in tragedy, or at least from the Munsterite perspective, from the Anabaptist. She goes over, but at a similar, very, very close time to her going over to attempt this with the Prince Bishop, somebody had defected previously to her and gone over and informed the Prince Bishop of what she was going to try and do. And so when she goes over, she's caught, and they basically, this is one of the first forms of torture, it's pretty nasty, is they put her on they have big wagon wheels, and they strap the girl to this wagon wheel with her arms out, her legs out, and they call it a breaking you on the wheel, and they just go around with a big metal bar and they break all your limbs on the wheel. So she's broken on the wheel. That's what happens to this poor girl. And after being broken on the wheel, they go and they cut her head off to end her suffering, just to kill her at this point. So that ends poorly. It doesn't work out. It was something you can imagine that the leadership of Jan van Leiden would have allowed, because why not? Some girl might have had success, but it's just a shame in so many of the deaths that happen here. Just a really, really sad death, and you see the age of the sort of people that are dying at this time for this. So now we get to ratchet up the weird a little more. That's going to continually happen in this story. If you think that it's already strange enough that you have somebody who's within a group of people and he can say that I am the voice of God and I'm going to tell you how to live, if that isn't weird enough, the next thing that happens is quite crazy. I guess especially if I have to lay some of the groundwork for socially how these people are. When you think of sexual freedom, these people are somewhat sexually free compared to other groups of other religious groups at the time. Maybe compared to Catholics, Anabaptists might be considered more sexually liberated, but it's still a sin to have slept with someone outside of marriage. You know, that alone is something that within this town you would be killed for. And so you can, when the next idea that is brought up by Jan van Leiden. So these are the sort of people who are okay with this guy being the prophet of God, but they're not okay. They're resistant to this next idea that he brings up. So you can imagine just how crazy the idea must have been. So what he says in a meeting with his new leadership is that he has been told by God that God wishes for the citizens of Münster to participate in the act of polygamy. So he wants everybody to get married up and to have multiple wives. And this is maybe why this story about Münster has been popularized through sources, because of this kind of devious sexual aspect that, you know, people couldn't believe that this kind of thing was happening back then. You know, to think of these very prim and proper people participating in multiple wife sex orgies is just something, you know, we'd consider strange now, and well, they definitely considered strange back then, given any of their other beliefs that they had. So a big thing that they have to do, because they want to instate this, is they need to justify it, and they go back to some Old Testament justification. And you've probably heard the name King Solomon, Solomon the Wise. Well, Solomon in the Old Testament had several hundred wives, and so with that justification, they're saying that this is, you know, this is something very, very practical that they should do. You know, if he's loved of God, and Solomon was loved of God, should it not make sense that this is practical for the city to participate in? Nothing crazy there about it. And then they try and go for practical, logical reasons. They're hammering home all the reasons why they can sleep with and have multiple wives. Another is that the women in Münster outnumber the men 3-1. And a lot of these women, I may not have mentioned this detail in the previous episodes, a lot of these women are nuns who were liberated by the Anabaptists when they came to the city, and they said it's not natural for you to be in I don't want to use the incorrect word here, a coven, or that's like witches. Maybe not witches. You're not meant to be in a nunnery. I think that's more accurate. And they liberate them, but then there's so few men that they can't be married off. And so the new leadership is saying that this is just a practical way for them to solve that problem. Now these women can answer that natural urge that they might have, but they can do so not in sin outside of wedding. They can do so within a polygamist relationship. So it's no problem at all. And more and more divisive factors showing up in Munster now. You can imagine with the people maybe in the leadership who can start to accept this, but there's a lot of people who are going to have issue with it because this extends to very young children. There's going to be people or children, girls under 15 years old, that their parents are now being told are going to be married off to a man who is, however many years their senior, more than half a lifetime in some cases. And this is already in a society, as discussed from previous episodes, where people, if they're not in concurrence with the leadership, that the doors should be left open to their houses, that you can be checked on at any time. Children are told to tell on their parents if they're not being faithful to the cause. There's a lot of things adding up where the people within Munster might start to and are taking issue with the leadership. Another point that should be made of the story is that it's not just simply all-out fanaticism and its success. A lot of people are having issue with just how extreme the Anabaptist leadership is behaving. And so once this has taken place for a little while, and there's some polygamist relationships going on, it sort of boils over. And in late July, there's a coup within the city, a very successful coup that manages to capture the whole group of leadership, and manages to get Bernard Rothman, Bernard Nipperdal, Van Leiden, all these guys in the town prison, and they get them, in the city hall. They get them all locked up. And you could reason at this point now that if they'd actually done something decisive, maybe all this continued violence might have stopped. And they may, and when I say that, I mean if they'd just taken the leadership out to the Prince Bishop and turned him over. But there was dissension in the ranks, and nobody could entirely decide what to do with them. And they just discussed and deliberated and talked for too long. And it ended up being that the zealots, the people who were still on the side of this new leadership, and there were lots of them, started to look around for the leadership and try and find out, well, where have they gone? Where have they gone? And because they took too long, they're found in the city hall, in the city hall jail, and they're freed from there. And what's the first thing that Van Leiden does? Well, he goes and he has all the people in the coup killed. And this is now really starting to boil down the people who are left in the city, because that was kind of a last gasp at sanity. These people who thought that the polygamy was too much, this ultra-communist lifestyle was boiling over into something that it shouldn't be. Now that these people had been found out and had acted and were being killed, there's less and less people in the city that would give any kind of opportunity in the future for this to be resolved peaceably. Now, it continues that the Prince Bishop is trying to, and it's not so much known by the people in the city, he's trying to deal with Van Leiden and this new leadership. He's sending, scouts, or not scouts, but people to deal with them and to try and come to a resolution again, because you can imagine the city is very, very valuable still. The more damage that they do to this city is bad news for the crown. They don't want to destroy the city, but it's looking more and more like they have to, because they've just got to get them out of there however they can. And that leads to August 28th and the second assault, this time sober and during the day. And the assault is organized. It's organized at the correct time. They start firing the cannons on them. They start, blasting holes and starting to approach in a way that should have yielded, you would think, more success. But ever a testament to the fighting power and the commitment of these people within Munster, they continue to hold them off. Apparently, the Munsterite women, from sources, are said to have been very, very amazing and strategically valuable, because they were able to plug and repair all these different holes that were being made in the walls that would have allowed people to come through. And something of a theme is developed where bad weather plagued the Prince Bishop whenever he went for one of these attacks. It just so happened that there was horrible weather, and it made scaling the walls that much more difficult. But I can go into some nitty-gritty detail there if you'd like, where they're scaling the walls, they're getting their ladders up there, they got grappling hooks. And the people who are fighting are hardened professionals on the Prince Bishop's side, and they're still having this difficult go of it, making more and more and more the point, the commitment of the Anabaptists behind these walls. Um, when they get to the top of these ladders, they're having their hands chopped off, they're cloven in two. These people are just getting destroyed trying to get over these walls. There's a quicklime, which I should have looked up the exact definition, but you can imagine this stuff gets on you and it just melts you, it disintegrates you. There's hot pitch that's being poured on the attackers as they're trying to go over the wall. Their ladders are being pushed off, and hundreds of the prince bishops attacking soldiers die in this fight, when the losses for the people on the inside, the Anabaptists, are remarkably low. Just a couple dozen people die within the town, which is remarkable given the resources that are being brought against them, and that they are not hardened professional soldiers that are having this fight. So when this goes down, when this happens in this second fight, it's just brutally unsuccessful. The Prince Bishop decides to dig in, and he doesn't care what the cost is going to be. He's just gonna starve them out. He doesn't care how long it takes. He's not going to lose hundreds and hundreds of more guys in this futile attempt while they're still able to defend the walls so well, and he's going to starve them out. A good idea for him. I agree with him. I think this is probably what you should do in the face of this situation, but not very popular among his political supporters, who want results for all the resources that they've been lending to him to bring a resolution to this issue. It doesn't look good that they can't control the Anabaptists. But, he says tough cookies, and so he continues to go with this approach that he's going to starve them out. And violence continues in the city, believe it or not. How surprising is that? Violence continues in the city. Anybody who's resisting the polygamy is being put to death daily. And again, I keep wanting to, and I have no problem ratcheting up the weirdness. It gets weirder and weirder in Munster. No big surprise. So the next weird event that happens is a lame goldsmith. I love the bizarre details from the sources that they have for this story. A lame goldsmith is seen in the town of Münster, making a claim. Ooh, he's got a great name. It's Jan Dusencher. And he says that Jan van Leiden is actually the second coming of a great historical religious figurehead from the Old Testament, that he's basically a reincarnation of this major figurehead, if he didn't already have enough power as it was. He wants to anoint him and make him a king, and he's got all this gear that he's made, because he's a goldsmith, all these beautiful jewels and rings that he brings to anoint King Jan. And he gets him, Jan's down on his knees, and he has a sword, and he goes through the whole thing, and he says that, it's your job to become the king of these people and to spread this Anabaptist faith around the world. And like a good leader would in this situation, Jan van Leiden begrudgingly accepts and says, I don't really want to, but I suppose I have to. I can't ignore this great responsibility. It's necessary that I take this on. And people continually thinking, we can't break the siege of our own town, and now you're telling us that you're a king and you're supposed to bring this message to the rest of the world. So weirdness ramps up, as does the whole being at odds with reality as it exists. So he is appointed king, and then a whole bunch of interesting things happen. Kind of a major point of this video, or this series, that I've tried to make a little bit, but I'll discuss in detail now. He starts to have things like royal clothing made and insignias made for his particular group that is in the leadership. And they even now get a bunch of retainers that start to walk around with them around the city. And it's just so interesting. Anabaptism stems from Lutheranism. And Lutheranism stems from the idea that we should be able to determine for ourselves our relationship with God or a higher power or whatever that is. And the reasons behind doing so are that whoever was in control before was trying to put themselves between you and your personal relationship with God, and you had this new movement to remove people like that. And you can see in Munster, in Anabaptism, in this case, and there was a whole bunch of different forms of Anabaptism, but now how they're literally becoming the thing that they hated. And I guess this should be the warning for any new idea that comes into existence, any new freedom, is that you should be mindful of that new freedom, not just then evolving it back into the thing that it was trying to fight against in the first place. So that's the point to make there. And it's a, yes, he's basically acting like a monarch. I've got some more notes here. These are important. There's class divisions very clearly, all sorts of inequalities when they're supposed to be a communistic society. But let's continue with this the story now that we have this idea that he's developed a monarchy within the city now. October 1534. The city is called together by Jan van Leiden at this point, and a captured bishop soldier is brought to the middle of the town. And Jan van Leiden plays, some nasty games with him, basically just kind of saying, if you were on the side that was right, then shouldn't you be free now? And it all basically amounts to him lopping his head off. He lops off this guy's head, and he says then that the siege will be broken on the town by Easter, March 1535, and by that time they will no longer need to worry. The siege will be broken, and if he's wrong, this is very important to see the way things have been progressing, that they can kill him, they can chop his head off, or they can put him on a stake. And you could probably see this now as an act of desperation, because you don't tell your population that you've said you have the power of life or death over, that they can have the power of life or death over you, unless you're really starting to fear for things, and that you need to give them something if they're going to continue to stay in your power. Okay, so it continues and continues, that another weirdness happens with that same goldsmith. The lame goldsmith shows up again, and he says that he has received another message, and that it's Van Leiden needs to send apostles out beyond the walls of the city to enlist aid, people with the message of the Anabaptists, who will then bring back support. And this seems to make sense. You'd imagine, without it literally saying it in the sources, that this guy's probably employed by Van Leiden or something, and is told to tell these messages to people to anoint him as king, things like that. And so, strangely enough, Van Leiden agrees with him and says, oh, this is probably as a result of me just saying that the siege will be broken, and God said the siege will be broken. It's that we need to do this. And so he chooses all these different individuals to be the apostles for him, and to send out these messages beyond the wall. And they're entirely unsuccessful. They go out beyond the wall, they try and sneak out, but the Prince Bishop has been waiting for it. He's been waiting and expects this kind of thing to happen. And so, for the most part, they all get killed. They all get killed, and there's going to be no help coming. I'm sorry, Münster. I'm sorry, Van Leiden. There's going to be no help coming, because they're all getting killed. Now, at this point, I thought this is really interesting. Any history buff who may have heard of this happening a number of times, I guess this precedent has been set as far back as something like this. The bishop, bless his heart, as much as he's a horribly violent medieval man, is still trying to communicate with the town, as much as he's killing all these people. He kind of has to, that's his job, or at least he'll be killed otherwise if he's not doing it. And he's kept trying to negotiate. Well, they say that they won't negotiate with him. And what he does now is he has messages made that are tied around blunted arrows. And the blunted arrows are sent over the walls into Münster, where if you were able to grab this message, you would see in the message, it says that we only want the leadership of your town. If you'll turn your leadership over to us, then you can all live. That you don't have to die for this cause that you've been fighting for so far. And if you grab one of these notes, no surprise, Van Leiden is going to have you killed. He's going to lop your head off like he seems to have a habit of doing with most people if they do anything. Pardon me. So things continue. The little brief note that I can make here, you have Bernard Rothman. He's this guy who is he's one of the other leadership figures. He writes a couple famous works and has them shipped out of the town at this point. Essays that are apparently still studied today, kind of appealing to the Reformation luminaries, saying that we came from your ideas, so aren't you in some ways responsible for what's going on here? Don't you want to give us a little help? And where the rest of Europe is not violent towards something other than Anabaptists, they're trying to enlist the aid of that other group. And Martin Luther, who's known for getting pretty fiery, fires back and says, you should know the difference between the word of God and acting, through the words of Satan. And he just hates the association of being considered the same as Anabaptists. They've just driven themselves so far away from the less radical parts of the Reformation that they are not going to get help through this method. That's the point. That the apostles going out, no help coming from them. There is no help coming to Munster. It's going the way of the dodo. And again, things are starting to get really, really bad in the city. He's given Jan van Leiden's given a point in time where he says, you can kill me if I'm wrong. So he's getting desperate. He calls another town meeting where he has been struck dumb beforehand and says, I have another message to give you in however many days. And he says that he was blinded in this previous message, and he was blinded, he was told by God, for taking on the sins of the people in the town, saying that the fact that he was willing to take on those sins and say that he could be killed if he was wrong, blinded him to the true nature of the last message he would receive. And that was to say that it wasn't actually that people in the town were going to be saved physically and that the siege was going to stop. It was that by that point they would be saved spiritually. So the siege might keep going. And this is where we can really see the past guy, the past leader, Jan Matthias. He went out on a field with 15 guys against 500 horsemen. He was crazy. A few sandwiches short of a picnic. The guy was nuts, but you couldn't blame him for the fact that he was at least acting in what he thought was right, even if he was absolutely mad. Jan van Leiden is an opportunist who wants to be a polygamist, who wants to march around as a king in his town, and who will change the message of God on the flip of a dime. And it's not even that he could plead insanity. He's just doing what is absolutely convenient. Absolutely convenient. By this point, everyone in the town is brutally, brutally starving. And it's a slow downwards hill. It's a downward slippery slope that's happening. And this is pretty gruesome too. Just a little preamble, if you want to shut your ears or whatever for whatever happens in the town. I will not be held responsible, but the starving is so bad in the town that sources say that it went from eating cattle to eating dags, from eating cattle to eating dogs and cats, to eating slugs, to eating bark and grass off the side of the road, to eating their dead, digging up their dead and eating their dead, to eating their children or their babies. So I'm sorry to share those darker details, but it's just the reality of the history that I want to share there. So I'm not going to make any jokes about that, but that's just the savage circumstances that these people were dealing with in this state. And a warning against religious extremists, because Van Leiden is still saying to these people in the town that, do not fear, this is God testing you. He's testing your faith. And if you have faith, he will turn, the cobblestones in the street to bread. It will happen, And people in their delirium, in their state, some people actually bit the stones and like broke their teeth on the stones because they wanted to believe what it is that he was saying. And you better believe that the higher ups in the town, the people a part of his clique, were still eating quite well. And so just a real frustrating reality that's sinking into Munster here and has for some time now. This rock star that came to lead him is not someone who should have ever been given as much power as he had. So it continues. People continue to defect, as you might imagine. It's starting to get really, really, really bad. And at this point, people are finally asking Jan van Leiden. They're saying, may we leave? Which is, it's bad because they know that waiting beyond the walls is the Prince Bishop. And the Prince Bishop doesn't really have a lot of patience, for these people anymore. He'll probably just kill them, but they're hoping to go and deflect. And he says, you can leave. Jan van Leiden says, you can leave, but you can't come back. And so these people are let out of the city gates, and they kind of go into the no man's land between the town and where the Prince Bishop is set up. And it's a no man's land, I may have said in the previous one, because they couldn't come within range of the town because the town had cannons, and so they had to be a couple football fields away to make sure that they weren't fired upon while they were waiting during this siege. And any of the men who went out into this no man's land, they were shot almost immediately by the Prince Bishop, and the women and children were just left to starve. And so you have these zombies milling around in this no man's land. It's really, really ugly. Sources do suggest that some of the women from the bishop's camp were trying to smuggle some food out to the women and children who were dying of starvation in the no man's land between the place. Now, on June 22nd, 1535, there's finally enough defectors that have come out and they've accepted at the Prince Bishop's camp and been kept separate from each other so he can confirm their information that he feels finally ready that they must be able to do an attack now with the rate of starvation and where people are at that could be more successful. And he's not going to take any chances though, because he's been bitten a number of times and he's been tricked a number of times, walked into a few traps. And so what he's going to do is send in a commando party of about 400 soldiers, a lot of which are defectors, and they're going to be put on the front line to guarantee that that whoever does die in this new assault is going to be them first and not his troops. And they slip in the deep of night, and they actually do get into the city, and they're killing guards and cutting throats, and they're getting pretty far into the city, and they've got all the passwords to progress into the city because the defectors have been giving them to them. And you would think at this point that they would get to the front gate. This is what the sources suggested. You would get to the front gate, and then you just open the front gate and start the assault. Even if it was night, you've managed to get into the city. You could do this, but they don't do that. For all intents and purposes, it says that they just set up in the town after killing a bunch of people and got a certain way through and just dug in and started to fight. It's dark, it's chaotic, and eventually their presence, the Anabaptists become alerted to their presence and start to fight them. And this continues and continues a long time into the night until 3 o'clock in the morning. There's a truce that's called by Van Leiden and both sides. It's not just Van Leiden says truce and everybody stops, but there's a truce called, and Van Leiden says, if you leave now and you throw down your weapons, then we won't kill you. We'll just let you go. And the people who have come in aren't having any of it. They refuse to do it, if only because they want this to come to an end, or they don't trust the Anabaptists to just put down their weapons and leave and be allowed to live, but they're having none of it. And they just set up in there in the night, and eventually they have one of their guys, they sneak up a guy with their standard bearer into one of the towers in the city, and he waits there till the morning and the sun comes up. And in the morning, he starts wailing away and saying their secret password or their word or whatever to know that the Prince Bishop, when hearing it outside, knows it's not one of the Anabaptists and it's actually their troop up in that tower. And the guy is saying that if you need to attack now, because this is the only chance you're going to have where the walls are undefended. We have moved far enough into the city with this little group and dug in that if you do attack, that you won't have that added resistance. And you better believe the Prince Bishop goes for it, and the city is broken into. And we are told that resistance bursts like a bubble. They've been fighting so hard, they've been doing so well, but just after this period of time, after the atrocities that they've lived through, their spirit is broken and they are finally defeated. Men are massacred. The men are massacred. The Anabaptist men are massacred. There's a lot of women who are killed. Maybe not quite so many. Sources are less clear on that, but it's brutal. They're all wiped out. And then we have the account of the leadership still in the city. We have Bernard Rothman, who was the old guild master of the town, who escapes. That's what's suggested, is that he escapes. And they didn't have any record of his body, but it may have been that he was so badly mutilated or killed in the fight that they may not have been able to recognize the body. So that possibility does exist, but it's not confirmed that his body was found in the wreckage afterwards, so it suggested that he escaped. You have Bernard Nipperdolem, and he is hiding in an attic for a little while, and he is found, and a woman gives him up who's hiding in the attic, so it is that her life will be spared. And you know what? After all this time, I really don't blame her. I would have supported her decision to do that. So she gave up Bernard Nipperdolem. And then finally, Jan van Leiden, again, fights like a demon for his cause. You couldn't fault him for that, as much as he is this charlatan, but he is caught outright. Now, if we look at ultimately the number of deaths of the people within the town, they have nothing exact, but there are rough figures suggesting between 8,000 and 10,000 Anabaptists in the town at this time. So we can say very comfortably that thousands died. Thousands died in this battle, and it was very bloody, nasty, and people went out in the worst medieval sort of slaughter that occurs at that time. And now we come to Jan, who there's this account of the bishop going in to see Jan at one point and saying, do you have any idea how much money you cost me, you bastard? And Jan, clever as always, quick on his feet, failed at everything, but he'll try everything, suggests a few ideas to save his life. And he says, you're absolutely right. I did cost a lot of money to you. So why don't you put me in a cage and put me on display as an oddity in a bunch of different towns where people can look at, this failed Anabaptist, and he's so crazy, and you can use me as an example of what people should not behave like. And the Prince Bishop says, no, that's not what we're going to do with you. And he tries one more time. He says, okay, well, fair enough. Maybe not just as an oddity. Maybe if you take me around, if you take me around to these Anabaptist towns that are, a little bit militant, I can speak to their leaders again as an example of how not to behave. The Prince Bishop says, no, we're not going to do that with you. So, on June 22nd, 1536, in the middle of the town, the Prince Bishop, watching from Bernard Nipperdolem's home, where Jan van Leiden gave his initial speech by candlelight to say that he should be the new leader, a platform is set up in the center of the town. Carts are brought in, there's wood put over top of it, and there's a number of coal braziers, I think. It's like a raised hibachi. And these are filled with coal, hot, piping, crackling flames coming off of them, and superheated tongs and hooks are put into there to start to heat slowly. And around this platform, there are 3 cages. And then at 8 o'clock in the morning, they bring out the already having been tortured for a while, Jan van Leiden, Nipperdolem, and Bernard Rothman. They bring them out to this platform, and everybody's out for the day, all the people from the town, which is pretty amazing to think that people would come out as a form of entertainment for this. And these people are not genetically dissimilar to ourselves. They are genetically the same, You just have to put it up to a spirit of the times, maybe, that people enjoyed this kind of violence so much. So they're brought out to the this torture platform, and in the middle of this platform, next to these braziers of hot coals, is a big pole, and this pole is right in the center of it all. And from the pole, coming down from the pole, are three long lines that are attached to collars, and the collars have hooks on them. This is basically that you can't really move around inside the collar once it's been put on you, because you'll spike yourself with the collar. And it is decreed that they should suffer by this particular form of torture for 1 hour. This is actually within their law, that you would suffer for this specific period of time. And if you were to be knocked unconscious, that time unconscious is subtracted from the amount of time that you have spent suffering already. So it's basically, if you're unconscious, that doesn't count. You have to be awake and suffering for your full hour before they'll actually kill you off. Just absolutely brutal. So they attach them one by one, and apparently Bernard Nipperdolum can't even speak when he sees this. I can imagine why. This is the most horrific thing that you could do to any human being. What's coming? Last chance, if you don't like ultra violence, then I wouldn't listen to this last bit. So they're each attached to it, and because of their proximity to each other, each one is going to be tortured, and each one is going to smell, hear, and feel on the pole that they're all connected to what the others are experiencing. Just gratuitous. So it is Jan van Leiden who goes up first, and what they do is grab these hooks and these tongs, these pincers, out of the heated brazier. They raise his arms, and they grasp underneath his armpit. And these things are so superheated that when they touch human flesh, it bursts into flame. And they rip and pull off chunks of you, chunks of flesh and tendon, and they slowly tear you to pieces. That's what it is that they're doing. And like I said, if you pass out at any time during this, they're going to revive you, and they're going to make you suffer for a full hour of being torn to pieces before it is that you're actually killed. They eventually rip out his tongue, they rip out his throat. This is Van Leiden, and they put a heart through his chest to put him out of his misery at the hour point. Bernard Nipperdolum tries to choke himself on the collar, and try and put himself out of his misery. He's so terrified to see what's going to happen, but they just cinch him up next to the pole so he can't move, and he can't remove himself from this. And he comes to the same bloody end as Van Leiden does. They tear him to pieces with the hot pincers, which is just horrible. A few closing details here. I had to edit out a weird chunk. I went on some strange rant at the end. Few closing details. The bodies were then put up in the cages that I had mentioned around the platform there, as a warning, of course, to anybody who might act out in the same way that the Anabaptists had. Of course, the Crown doesn't want that to happen. The pincers were put up next to it as well, quite prominently displayed. And believe it or not, you can still see pictures of this on the internet. Those cages are still there, and the pincers are still there to this very day. Pretty amazing when you think about it, that many hundreds of years ago now. So this has been quite a series for me. I'm pretty ambitious, but I really enjoyed it. And if you've made it to the end, I really appreciate it, because these have been long videos to just sit down to, and many of us don't spend this amount of time with multi-million-dollar TV shows or movies, let alone some guy who's just talking about history on the internet. So I really appreciate it if you made it this far. That's pretty cool. Yeah, what a journey. I'm trying to think. Final notes. Not a lot to say. It was just a lot of fun to make it, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as it was a pleasure for me to create. Yeah, If you enjoy this video, please do like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. And like I like to say, until we meet again next time, world, thanks for tripping with Dave, and ciao for now. Peace. Don't be incredibly violent and religiously extreme or something.